instead of us being seeing students as empty vessels, we have to see ourselves like a collaborative, like a sopa, right? Like we put a
Yeah.
little bit of this and a little bit of that. And if we can combine those things together and we get it brewed right, it can create something, a really good soup, a good sancocho, like that goodness that fills the belly and warms the soul. That's kind of what my gig is.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of I Have Something to Say, where subject matter experts are unafraid and unapologetic about sharing their perspectives regarding issues that impact our lives. They speak up because basically they give a shit. So if you're tired of canned answers and want to finally hear real people cut through the BS and talk about real issues, this is the podcast for you. I'm your host, Sami Jimen Marrero from Urbender, and behind our mixer is our producer, Chris Majoka from UdoU. Hi, everyone, and I hope you had a wonderful, wonderful holiday break and new year. And today we're going to kick it off with something that's clearly very important for all of us, and it's our kids and their education. And I wanted to bring a trailblazer in the education community, Dr. Latasha Casterlow-Lalla. She's an educator, author, motivational speaker, agent of change, and doctor. You bring such a different perspective to education that I was just wowed when we first met. Introduced by my dear friend Navas, who kind of like threw me into the tech space. And just hearing you speak about how we need to transform the way education is delivered, right, to our students just made me think about the struggles I've had with my kids who are now teenagers, but also gave me some hope because you're all about infusing culture and lived experiences into the learning process. And just talk to me about how you landed in this space, and welcome. I'm just excited that we're finally having this conversation.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This is so exciting. I'm really humbled by the invitation to have a conversation and kind of share a little bit about, I call it my mission work with others. So I'm a simple bear. I'm the granddaughter of sharecroppers. So I am the descendants of individuals who didn't have access to a full education. And as a result, it really led my journey. Having grandparents who had the pleasure of just finishing third grade or sixth grade and having to work, picking cotton up until 1983 and sharecropping. And so as a family, it was very much instilled in us at an early age that education was everything. So I am a ferocious reader, and really started to understand that I kind of stand on the shoulders of folks who went before me. I, grew up in this awesome city, Passaic, where I got my start and learned so much from people, from places. We were a very diverse community with, we have Asian, Latino, African American, Caribbean, and it was Southeast Asian. And so all of that taught me about how we got to learn about one another, not just in what we did in school, but just learning from friends, going to their homes, different foods, cultures. So I think that kind of started that zest for multiculturalism and understanding culture for myself. I graduated from there and decided to go to college. I went to Montclair State, where I had the pleasure of being a music education major. And that was a really pivotal experience because when I was in that program, there was a very big emphasis on the classics and didn't really allow too much in reference to culture to be brought in, which was interesting as outside of school, I was leading a choir at 14. I was playing 11 instruments. I was singing all over the country, just doing like wedding gigs and stuff, but none of that counted when I was in school. And it was like, wow,
Right.
you're missing out on all this experience that you don't even know that I have because it doesn't fit in a neat box. So
Mm.
when I came out and I decided to start teaching, After a little bit of time in higher ed, I worked in higher ed for a little bit. I came back as a music teacher and wanted to make sure that we were connecting with kids. I wanted to make sure that my classroom was a place where kids could tell me a little bit about what they like, what they enjoy. We could still talk about what I need to teach you too, but I want to make those connections. So I did that as a music teacher for a while, tried to be innovative, bringing all my experience to the forefront. And then I lost my job because of budgets. So I wind
Mm.
up becoming a classroom teacher. And they were like, "Oh, come back to music." I was like, "That's okay. I know this classroom gig's gonna be here. That's good." I decided to pull in some of my artistic abilities into that. So led lots of multicultural history from Latin History Month to Black History Month, and really worked on plays and really getting kids to be expressive and connect to their expressive ability and demonstrate that in school so we could see a little bit more of who they were. Did that for a bit, about 7 years, and then decided maybe I want to expand my reach through
Mhm.
administration. So went got my degree and wound up becoming the supervisor of gifted and talented education, and that was great because I was a gifted and talented kid and had the opportunity to speak about the topic from the perspective of a student and now as a teacher who had been in a couple of different grades and had some different experiences with different children, and really worked to create a Saturday Academy program that was focused on enrichment because I know that we have to help students learn the core, but we also know that it's those things that students are passionate about which pushes education forward. So it was my passion project, and it's still running. I don't run it anymore, but
Mhm.
it's running, and it allows students to kind of connect to their learning from Monday through Friday to also their interest areas and build them together in a project based learning approach, which is really great. So I did that for a little bit. Then I became an assistant principal where I got to open a gifted and talented specialty school. It was a magnet school, and got to completely work with my colleague to design that. And then I became the supervisor of visual performing arts. So I've been doing that for about now 8 years and really focused a lot on having students connect the music and culture and the vibe that they live in to what we're learning in school and keeping those not so far apart. And what I've learned in time is it's as if sometimes in school we have children put their suitcase on a shelf. There's a
Mhm.
text about la maleta, and it's kind
Yeah.
of like we operate in school sometimes like that, where all that you do outside of school, just put that right over there because we're going to fill you up, and we
Mhm.
don't always value the fact that our children have something that we can utilize and we can connect. So instead of us being seeing students as empty vessels, we have to see ourselves like a collaborative, like a sopa, right? Like we put a
Yeah.
little bit of this and a little bit of that. And if we can combine those things together and we get it brewed right, it can create something, a really good soup, a good sancocho, like that goodness that fills the belly and warms the soul. That's kind of what my gig is.
That is awesome. And so I love that you lived these challenges as a kid, I'm sure, right? And although I mean you're in the Northeast in New Jersey, right, in that area where clearly a lot more progressive, part of the country, which I'm sure afforded you some opportunities that perhaps in other areas like rural areas or like we're in Florida, right? And that so things are just different. Let's just call it different in terms of the approach towards education. So the fact that you were able to early on, through your experience, recognize that void in the system that left out the lived experiences that students were already bringing in. They're already bringing stuff to the table, and then because you were that student, and then combining this love for music that you have, and not only that, it's almost like you were a child prodigy, right? Playing 11 instruments and really immersed, right, in music and being able to actually fulfill that potential. Now as a teacher, what a gift to have choose this career path that really gives back all of this accumulated knowledge and to create a new way of doing this. Now, I know that this is the topic of your dissertation, right? It really
Parts of it.
was about, yeah. So talk to me about first why you decided to study, the infusion of culture and the delivery of education, right? In a meaningful way, and to craft it in a different way. Like, what does that look like? Because I can imagine that you must have in your throughout the years, right? Because you've been doing this for a couple of decades already.
Yeah.
It must have been challenging to propose this new way of approaching education when you first started.
I think it's different, and I think we all know that change is something that has to be made. I think the interesting part is that the demographics of the nation are really lending themselves to wanting us to think about some pieces, right? So for me, I think I started this work because it was a void for me as a student. And I felt like, wow, like I never forget, like there was a part in my collegiate career where there's something when you're a music major and you wanted to sing a song. And I wanted to sing a specific song. It was a gospel song. And it was as if I had to really advocate very strongly to have the approval to sing the song. And I was like, wow, that's crazy. Like that's how I felt. Like this is crazy.
Yeah.
Um, but, so then it started making me think, wow, well, how much are we missing? And so I'll tell you the big thing that proposed this for me is really learning a lot about culturally responsive pedagogy. And, just the person who's like, I would say the guru and the founder of that is Dr. Gloria Latson Billings. And just the definition of the fact that we leverage students' culture and their lived experiences to help them learn in the classroom to me sounded just a brilliant yet so simplistic. However,
Right.
it's being done. So when I decided to go for my doctorate, I called it my pandemic project. I was like, "Hey, what if we're actually in this thing for a year?" I never thought we are gonna actually be in the thing for a year. But,
Right.
I was like, "I want to figure out a way to find out how teachers are being prepared." And so I really started thinking about the teachers I experience. And just in conversations with people, how very oftentimes people don't have teachers that look like them. If you're a child of color, right? If you could be black, you could be Latino, you could be Asian, you could be Southeast Asian, you could be Pacific Islander. How often we don't have teachers who look like us. And so it kind of led me to try to start some digging, and that's when I started to see that, when you look at our nation's teachers, 87% of our teachers are white. And there's no problem with that. But then the question becomes, how do we ensure that these folks who are teaching students are connected to culture and understand cultural norms, and all the elements of culture? A lot of times we talk about culture, people think of food and language and music. And that's true. Those are culture. But there are some core pieces on values and beliefs, the way that we see appropriateness in communication. And I started to think, well, how do teachers get prepared to work with diverse students? And if you look at our demographics as a nation, by the year 2026, our K through 12 population will be 60% students of color. However, our teaching population is 87% white. So there's just dissonance in ensuring that our teachers are ready and amply prepared to support students, and understand all the things that are going on, because there's a lot of differences. Even if you're talking from a racial perspective, you can't just say like black, right? Like black is not, what do you mean? Who are you talking about? And so
Right.
it lends itself to talk about this bigger conversation on the importance of ethnicity, not just race. Because if you talk to a student who identifies as one race, you have to kind of peel back that next layer of the onion to understand who they are, and norms and family norms, and I call it finding out people's why.
Right.
And I don't know that we do that. And as a result, I think we're seeing some elements of dissonance and, maybe some misjudgment, some stereotyping, not on purpose, just because. we don't take the time. And so when I started with my dissertation, I wanted to find out how many teachers are actually trained in understanding about culture or what experiences they had with culture during their pre-service teaching education program. And while my study was small, I will say that pretty much no one received that type of information. So it lends itself to some more work that we have to do in the field of education to better support our teachers, which in turn better supports our learners, making our nation richer, more diverse, and more culturally aware.
Yes, absolutely. And more understanding too. I mean, I'm hearing you speak and I'm thinking about when my kids were little, especially my son. Now throughout the years, this community has become more diverse and also the teaching population has become more diverse, but I'm talking 10 years ago,
Sure.
right? I remember when he was in kindergarten and I received a call. And basically, the complaint was that he's too touchy feely. That my son, and I'm like, because that's what we do. Like, we love on our kids so much that we're constantly hugging them and holding them and yumminess. And I don't know, if that's a bad thing or a good thing. We're not qualifying, right, the behavior. But then I had to tell my kid, who was what, 5 6 at the time, and I said, Pedro, you can't hug Mikhail all day. You can't. He's like, and he was like, but mama, I love him, like his
Right,
best
right,
friend,
right.
right? And so then it was like, so I was like, oh my God, what am I gonna
So
do
you
over
feel like you're
here?
killing the
Right?
spirit,
What in the
right?
world? So I reached out to the little boy's mom, and now Anna is a friend, right? They're friends. But the first day we got the boys together here in the house, they were scrambling on the floor like boys do, right? They were all over each other. And it was great, right? But it took that step, there was judgment, there was
Right.
limitations, barriers put into place that were really stifling
Mhm.
the demonstration of caring, right? Children at that age are not as verbal, I think, right, as when they grow up. And so it was just a demonstration of affection. That's all it was, right? But I think in the eyes, the perception was, why is this kid like constantly grabbing, and hugging and all over, right? His friend, and so it's just so I had to come in and explain it, right?
Sure. And I
To
think
to the
that's the challenge, right? That's the
Yeah.
challenge is that it's the openness of conversation. So tell me, that's why norms, values, and beliefs are the things about culture that are actually not spoken. So like
Mm,
it's funny. I'm from a large family. Like my dad are from North Carolina, and my husband is from the Caribbean. And so in our families, it's allowed. And so I know a lot of people like, people feel like, oh, well, and this is honest, this is a general statement, like, oh, some African Americans are allowed or Black people are allowed, right? Well, it's funny. I was like, I really started to say, well, let me think about why. So just to give you context, my mother is one of 16. I have 150 first cousins on my mother. And not like second, third. I don't the second and thirds and fourths, I count them, but like that's another 50 or 60 people. And so you say, "Oh, well, somebody's loud." And I'm like, "Oh my gosh, when we were children, when we got together, there were 150 of us in the house." So you know what? I got to speak up because it gotta be heard. And so again, it's like, wow. And I really started to think as I was doing the dissertation, how many teachers even knew that about me. They didn't even know. They didn't
right.
know my mom and my dad had picked up and came here from the South. They didn't know that my parents attended school, and my parents attended school and never were in an integrated environment. My parents
Mm,
are the last graduating class in their area that was a completely segregated educational experience.
wow.
So there's all these things that are like valuable that could have been brought in or just to understand me more. And I have to tell you, I had great teachers. They were lovely people. They really did work with me. They're very encouraging and supportive. But I also say to myself, wow, imagine how much more those lines of bonds could have been built between myself and my classmates, as well as my teachers, to help understand some perspectives. Because I think that's what it is, right? It's about understanding perspective where people were. I think about a lot of the folks when I was a kid whose parents did not speak English and they were that translator, right? And
Yeah.
really the the immense, I don't want to say pressure because I don't think it was pressure, but the immense responsibility as a child being 7
Yeah.
or 10 or 12, having to be responsible and understand adults talking adult talk, but like you're not adult, but yet you're responsible for that. And so we still have children in places and spaces that are doing that on a number of levels. And so that's why culturally responsive pedagogy and learning about your learners, understanding who they are, what they value, what they see, and seeing that it's not one size fits all, right? I think
Yeah.
that's the interesting thing about education that's morphing right now is that up until maybe I'd say maybe 15 years ago, it was a one size fits all. This is the model. This is what we do. Doesn't matter. And I think now we're seeing educational institutions shift and understand, hey, we have to provide some more for our students. We have to look at this. We have to peel back those layers, understand our families, engage our parents, and understand that parents aren't not present because they don't want to be. Many of our parents are working very hard. The cost of living is astronomical, no matter where you are living. And sometimes the lack of presence, physical presence, doesn't mean that emotionally and mentally those parents aren't there and pushing their kids to be great. And that's a more of the need to understand culture and understand where people are coming from, and how we can support learners. Because at the end of the day, in just a few years, most of our learners will be students of color,
Mm-hmm.
and continue to encourage them to move on, to continue to have a very robust and innovative nation. And if you look at the numbers of students of color and the number of students of color who are going into college, we have some serious dissonance that we need to fix, and we need to continue to advocate and support. And so that's why I think like it's important to understand culture, and gain some more in it and figure out how we can infuse it in school to help kids be successful.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I know that in those interactions and in those culture clashes, right? In the education system, because that's what it really is. Um imagine, I feel like I mean, I command English, right? So I was able to advocate directly without the intervention of my kid. But imagine those parents that are English language learners, right?
Mhm.
Not only frustration, but I feel like, since we know that education is so important, like you mentioned earlier, right? It's like, this is it. We pour ourselves into our kids and push them into education because we know how critical it is to attain. But that sense of angst, I almost feel like it's not only frustration but like a sense of angst when you can't really convey and communicate directly adult to adult to try to mitigate any kind of misperception, lack of support, access to resources,
Sure.
understanding, any situation that might be troublesome and that needs to be clarified or
Mhm.
corrected. Anyway, all of that stuff, and it's emotionally draining for
Yeah.
parents.
And the
It
bravery. I call it bravery to walk in the door. So
Yeah.
many and I'll tell you because I do happen to work into a district where we do have a lot of parents who are English language learners, and they are trying to navigate the best they can. And like I've tried my best to learn Spanish. Like I'm really going to go in like hardcore now that I'm finished with my studies. But I understand I just can't speak. So it's funny as I began to learn. I realize how challenging because you
Mhm.
know what you want to say. You get what
Mhm.
you're saying, but you just can't find the vocabulary and put it together. And so I tried to start learning because I wanted to understand what it was like to be an English language learner. And it's funny, I tell people all the time, give me a minute. I'm still translating in my mind.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
once you start trying to do it, you're like, "Oh my gosh." So when I was a school leader, a lot of my parents, I was like, they knew I could not speak, but I would just tell me. just talk to me and tell me what you need. And I've learned enough where I understand, and then I can help them. And a lot of the parents were like, just thank you. Like, no, of course, I'm here to serve. And I think that that's one of the things that we have to also keep in mind about education. And I tell people all the time, we are in the service business. Um, I serve a community. A community employs me to be of service to its citizens and its residents and its children.
Mhm.
So I have a responsibility to make my families comfortable, to make this place a space where they feel welcome. It's their space. They, in some way, shape, or form, contribute to making sure that we're able to provide these services. And so it's this concept of educators seeing themselves as community servants, um,
Mhm.
and to be there for our families because their child's success is our collective success.
Yeah. Yeah, that's deep. And so, question to you, Dr. Casterlow, how do we bring this to the table for teachers, right? Like, what does this look like
Hmm.
in terms of equipping teachers, that 87%,
Sure.
white,
Mhm.
educators, pool of educators that need to, and it's not to say that, they haven't, incorporated, but how
Mhm.
can we take it to the next level so that way the experience, so that way we how do you say, accelerate change? That's what I wanted
Yeah.
to say.
I think the first thing that we need to think about is, I think teachers have to know themselves, right? And so, who are you? Like, do your own personal self inventory. Who are you? What are your identities? What speaks to you? What do you lean to? Because I think about the intersectionality of who I am, right? I am I'm an educator. I'm a wife. I'm a mother. I'm a daughter. Um, I am an American citizen. I'm a Bayesian citizen. I am in my 40s. So, like, I'm a 90s kid. I'm also in an organization, I'm in a sorority. And so I have friends. I'm multicultural. I love Spanish music. I love, food. So, okay, that's who I am. And if I'm all those complex things, then by looking at myself, I have to then look at my students and say, wow, they're probably just as complex as I am. And so I think the thing is really doing inventory and surveying of students that you serve. And it might be on a global level, like depending on how many students you are. So if you're a classroom educator, it might be creating a survey where you get to learn about your students, just so that you can have them completed and you have this information. You can talk about having students, if you have a huge number of students, being more general about it. But and then also researching your community. So the community that I happen to work in is an immigrant community. It's always been. It's a community that's about to be 150 years old, and we
Mm.
have seen settlers from Dutch, Italian, Polish, Black, Caribbean, Latino. We've had a huge number of cultures that have all cycled through this community. And it's an ever changing community that was a previously a really big hub for manufacturing. So, by understanding that about my town, I understand that a good chunk of our teachers were from town when the town
Mhm.
was different. And so understanding that context and saying that, wow, things have shifted and changed, that's going to help me understand and explain to my students shifting, changes, transitions, seasons, and reasons. And then I think once you start to learn a little bit more about your students and take an interest in who they are, I feel like students kind of come through for you, because they see that there's value. Because if there's anything that's really important in this world today, it's about connection,
Yeah.
and people want connection. And our children, this is what I always say is really important too. Our children are consumers. They're not like we were. We were not consumer children, right? We were super
Yeah.
happy with whatever you gave me. You gave me a marble and a ball. Oh my gosh, I'm winning. I'm the best, right? It didn't matter what color. I was just happy that you gave it to me. My children are not like that. My children have been marketed to their entire life. So thinking that you're going to make a student do something Mm, you're probably not, right? These children are very much used to people tailoring things to them, um, really constructing it for them. They are used to, I call it you know, the model of choice, right? You think of there's tons of restaurants that our children go to, and they can get the thing that they want their way.
Right.
So if that's the case, they go to school and it's not like that.
No.
And so I feel like that's sometimes the dissonance. So it's really understanding who you're serving and getting some context around that. And I think that helps us in understanding what's needed. So that's where teachers can start learning who they are as an individual and all the different identities that they have. And then looking at their students and understanding that those identities may rise. And depending on what space and place the student is in, that identity might come forward. Like if I'm the only female in the room, then that identity might be the one I claim to. But if I'm the
Right.
only person of color in the room, I might claim to that identity. And also understanding that that's what happens to our students because they are living in a world that's a little, it has exposed us more to some of those things at an earlier age than previously done.
Yeah, yeah, totally. And so then now crafting lessons, because
Yeah.
this is like your area of expertise, right? Is to take transform it, right? And make it culturally meaningful so it engages and it connects with and engages students in a different way. And then you present it as not even B, C, D, but Z, right? It's like, let's
Mhm.
take all of this. What's missing in this curriculum, right? That we can infuse it with culturally relevant content without losing the learning value, right? And then presenting in a different way. And I know that music and art and pop culture is something that's really big for you in the way you do that, right? So
Yeah.
what does that look like? Could you give me an example of,
Yeah.
something small, right? Because I'm sure
Yeah.
it's very complex. It's not, I'm
It
sure it's
is.
not easy. And it requires a lot of creativity, I could imagine, too, right?
I think so. I think the idea is helping students understand that knowledge is important. And I know that a lot of people feel like, oh, well, I have to throw out the content to do this quote unquote feel good stuff. And it's like, that's not the case. The idea is that you're definitely making sure that you're having high quality content being presented to students. What you're trying to do is trying to figure out a ways to help students better solidify their understanding of that high quality content. And you're leveraging culture and your knowledge of your students' culture to help them make critical connections so that they can learn the content. And
Yeah.
that's where I sometimes feel like it gets lost in the sauce. So, like
Yeah.
for example, for my particular program, after the George Floyd murder, it was really a lot. Like as a nation, we're reckoning. As an African American woman, I was reckoning. I have a father, I have two brothers, I have a husband, I have son and nephews, and it was like, wow. How do I better make sure that people have exposure and understanding, not just from the surface level, but that deeper level connection of what value and culture means? And so, one of the things that I looked at was I explored how we could infuse that in music and arts. And so what I found that we did in music and arts, or we weren't doing, was students weren't being able to see people that looked like them. And I was like, oh yeah, we're doing that. We're totally doing that. We're exposing kids. And when I took a look at my own curriculum, I said to myself, okay, no, you're not, right?
Mhm.
We do a couple of things here, Black History Month, here at, Hispanic Heritage Month. And I was like, that's not where it should be. It should be completely interactive and infused. So what I did was I made a conscious decision to shift instruction. Uh, I said, let's talk about skills. And we really got really deep about what are the skills that we wanted students to learn in our process. And then what I decided to do was I used popular culture and music and art to do that. And so we teach the classics, but we equally teach popular art forms as a way for students to connect because they're going to see music that looks like them. And believe it or not, the thing that people tend to forget about the classics is that often in music and art, classics we are talking about pretty much happened before 1960.
Mm.
Take a minute and give yourself some context about whose stories were being told prior to 1960s. There's a
Right.
lot of people in this nation that don't have their stories told.
Right.
So I realized that how can I say that we're teaching them about diverse cultures and abilities when we stop at 1960. And we know that a very large migration to the north, a migration from other countries really started to begin in the 40s and 50s. And
Right.
so what I decided to do was I started to teach music and art from a popular culture lens and talked about genres that have happened post 1960, and
Right.
then connected it back to our classics that influenced those popular genres. So as a result, our students get to see people who sound like them, who have similar backgrounds than them, and they equally get to learn about some of the classics. So it's like a fusion. And so we've seen some really good responses. We're in year 3 of this brand new curriculum that we've purchased, I mean, that we've bought and we've created. And the thing is that it's something where it's not really being done. So our kids learn about 50 Cent, and they also learn about Mark Anthony, and they also learn about Beethoven. And we make sure that we've thought about who are all the cultures and identities that we have current in our society, and we want those all represented too, so that students understand I can take the knowledge and the skill set that I know as a musician or as an artist, and I can connect that. And I can see that same skill set from a classical realm, from a country, from a hip hop, from a rock, from a pop, from show tunes, because I understand music and I see that the elements are utilized all through, and I get to see a number of different people who do this work. So if I can see a number of different people do that work, I can find space if I'm interested in doing that work to do the work too.
That's yeah. So yeah, it's about seeing yourself reflected in those spaces too, right? And represented in those spaces too. This is really fantastic. I think that that there's I mean, I can't even imagine the music that's going to come out now. You know, we got to be on the lookout, right? Because if all of this has been missing and all
Sure.
the
And the infusion
framework,
of technology. Like
right, the framework was all before 1960. Imagine, you know, with this new approach what the outcome is going to be, because it just brings to the table so much more variety, right? So much more
for sure.
variety that wasn't there before. Wow.
And
And
fusion.
this applies to other subjects too, right? I'm sorry.
Oh, for sure. No, no, absolutely. Like it can be done so well because so many students, they're very familiar with sometimes their home countries or their countries of origin, where
Right.
they know information, they're listening, they're hearing the stories. You know, I always say that we don't give our kids enough credit, right? They're listening all
Yeah.
the time. And they're making connections. And so, what a beautiful place for us to have in every single classroom, having students pull pieces in. I just happen to do it in music and arts world, but you think to yourself from a historical perspective, there is so much that's happening that has happened in small pockets in different places across the world and allowing students to come in. And I think that's the other part about why it's important to get to know who your students are,
Yeah.
because our students identify from a racial and a cultural perspective, but we often forget that we have students who identify from a linguistic perspective or
Mhm.
also like where like an environmental perspective. So I always tell people all the time that many of our students identify with being their race, their culture, their language, and then where they grow up. So, like,
Right.
are you a rural kid? Are you an urban kid? Are you a suburban kid? And then what does that mean? Because every section of town that you might live in might identify differently. It's something that's really phenomenal for us right now is that we have a large number of Latino children in the city that I serve, right? But they love K-pop and they love anime. That has nothing to do with, but guess what? If they're finding identity in that, how can we leverage that? They're like 100% watching these shows. They are listening to the music in a language that they do not understand.
Yeah.
However, there's something about what that is presenting that speaks to them. We have to connect to that and use
Yes.
that as fuel to keep the learning going.
Yeah, totally. And yes, I totally get it, right? And it's just understanding what appeals to people, like it's marketing. This is
It is
marketing.
marketing. It is. And we can't say that we're the only show in town because of all of these platforms that are now
Yeah.
available to students. they don't technically always need us. So that's where the dissonance sometimes comes with engagement. So we've
Yeah.
got to say, hold up, I heard about this. Tell me about that. How does that connect to our learning here today? What are some of
Yeah.
the elements we can pull out? That little conversation can say, oh, snap, my teacher knows what's happening.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I now remember that concept because of that association.
Yes. Yes. And also honor the way they learn, because kids learn too, because again, going back to my kids, I'm just listening to you, and it's so true, because over the pandemic now, with the war,
Yeah.
my my son comes, we were talking, my husband and I, one day, and I'm like, oh, this, the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, he's just like amazing, right? And my son goes, he said, yeah, and to think that, he's a comedian. And I'm like, wait, what are you talking about, right? So
Phenomenal.
yeah, so he got into the we had this whole conversation about bravery, about honesty, integrity, and all of this. But what drew his attention was learning that he was a celebrity who
Yeah.
rose, right? And so, and he admired him, but and I'm like, he wasn't a comedian. He's like, yes, he was, and I'm like, how do you know that? Oh, YouTube, right? So yeah, that's a, but I was so happy that he's learning something. I'm like, okay, great. I don't care, how you learned it, but at least he's informed, and he's connected to, you know, um, yeah, to current events. Who knew, right? That a 15-year-old would be so in tune
Yeah.
with current events. Yeah. So it's a powerful way to think about how all of these different ways that people can learn, but I feel like the system finds it daunting and overcomplicates it, when clearly, you've figured out that it's just a matter of listening and asking questions and probing and connecting, um, with that human centered lens.
It's hard. It's tough. Like it's tough. And listen, education's not easy because it's not a one size fits all model. I will say I believe that this is though. This is so important because with all that we're seeing within our world with people, I call it needing to be seen. Um, it's so awesome. Can you imagine if your student had 8 teachers and 8 teachers were touching base with them? And maybe they're connecting on different levels, and that's fine. That's absolutely great. But it's that idea that hey, my teacher sees me more than just the person who's on the roster, but can peel back. And I always say to folks when I do some like workshops and stuff, I'm like, hey, can you tell me 3 or 4 things about student X? Because don't tell me about their academics, don't tell me about their grade, tell me beyond that. And so that's what's really important. And I think that our children are experiencing that, from just the interactions and the marketing that they experience as a person, as a consumer. And they're looking for that. And I think that's a really good start to try to continue to awaken our schools and to engage further with our students because students want connection.
Yes, definitely. And I know now with Web3, that's a whole other layer. And I know that you're also, taking a
Yeah,
close look at that, because it's a tool. It's a tool that needs to be incorporated as well, to make sure that we connect with our children as we move forward, with this demographic shift,
sure.
and just in the shift in how we do work also. I mean, it affects
Technology,
everything. Yeah.
technology, like the fact that our students, it's funny. I always tell people, students know the technology to use.
Yes.
Um, and we need to support them in using it and thinking about what do they know how to use, how do they use it, how do they go about it, how can we use it to leverage learning. We did that with our music technology program, and we infused it. We have students making music. There's more than one way to do it, right? So yeah, you
Hmm.
can do it an acoustic perspective with instruments, but there's a digital and electronic perspective. And we started a program where students are learning about the foundation of music, but using the digital tool to create it. We've had students release albums. We've had students learn how to DJ and are now traveling and making money by doing that. And so I think what's also important about learning is we teach them so that they have the knowledge sense, but we also help and empower them to take the knowledge and make income producing activities. Because if we want to give kids encouragement, we have to give them purpose. And if I'm teaching you how to do this, and we have one of our students who's now out there being a professional DJ, we have shifted the trajectory of their life, right? Because hey, I don't have to maybe do this activity that where I make this much money and I got to work 40 hours a week. I can do
Right.
this and I can make more. And one thing, it's teaching them entrepreneurship. It's really challenging when you think about every content area from writing. They have to be able to present themselves and give contracts. From a mathematic perspective, they have to be able to balance their books and know what their expenses versus their profits are. Like we're doing stuff historically, they have to know how to do research in order to know how to create a party that's going to meet the needs of their client. So we're doing all of this stuff saying, I taught you how to DJ. So
Yeah.
we're doing that and connecting. And it's things like that, meaningful opportunities for students get to go and apply their skills. And boy, oh boy, are students really rising to the occasion. And listen, and equally still producing those doctors and lawyers and teachers and doctors. That's great. We also want to continue to help students understand there's a lot of jobs out there. Things are continually changing and evolving. We need you to take those skills and connect. But the way that we can do that is understanding what the interest levels are of our students and connecting them together.
That's fantastic. Listen, I know this is the first of many conversations we're gonna have, that Dr. Casterlow, because this is just a fascinating topic. And I know, because we've spoken before, that you're just a constant learner yourself. You're always looking for ways to improve.
Hmm.
The serving kids and teaching kids. You're like, ooh, oh,
Yeah,
what's this? How it
yeah,
how can we use this, right? To and so and I'm just excited to know that you're a leader in your community, that you've dedicated so much time really to studying this topic deeply, so that way you're able to convey, right, the importance of it, and not only convey it but apply it, teach people how to apply these learnings into everyday teaching, so that way we can create something new. Any last minute advice you'd like to give to educators out there, and
sure.
to parents too,
Sure.
to what to look out for?
I think the first thing is that I think the one thing I want everyone to know is that all people have culture. And in a lot of the work that I do, I often run into, I work with educators, and a lot of them are like, oh, no, 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 I don't have culture. My kids have culture. I'm like, I'm so sorry. You do have culture. Everyone has culture. Tell me about your rituals. Tell me about your norms. Tell me about your traditions. That's culture. And
Mhm.
everyone's is important. And so I think that for educators and parents, um, just doing your own self inventory is effective and really great to think about what do you do. I think another element of it is asking your students, making sure that you speak and talk and converse with them about what their cultures are and the multiple layers of it, not what you think you see. I always have, it's an interesting thing. I have three children, and one of my children has a skin tone that's similar to mine, two do not. So people make an assumption about them and then they meet me and they're like, I'm a little confused. So making sure that you don't make assumptions, you don't know who children are. Listen, we are in this beautiful, um, multifaceted shade vision of people, and just making sure that you ask. I think that's most probably the most important thing, and then just seeking to understand and helping to explain to be understood, just because everyone doesn't know. Everybody's not from the same space and place. We never know what people's stories are, but having an open ear to listen is always helpful. And I think just by listening and learning, we can start to find some ways where we find commonality, and we can learn from the beauty of our differences.
I love that. Thank you so much. This conversation has been a gift, and I really look forward to continuing to grow this friendship because I really admire the work you do. Thank you so much, Latasha. This was great.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
This concludes this episode of I Have Something to Say. We want to thank you for tuning in. Don't forget to tell your friends about us. We're on Spotify and iTunes as well. There's more to come next week. And remember, if you have something to say, it's time to speak up.